Hi, everyone. Welcome to Power Shifts. I'm Joseph Lavoie, and today we're going to look at how the automaker Ford outfoxed Trump back in 2019. This is a case study in a regulatory foresight and compliance leadership. So last year, I began stitching together a framework I'm calling the 8 regulatory powers, which I know is not going to win me any branding awards, but the concept is clear. The most successful companies don't just react to regulation, they shape it. And failure to master even one of these powers, I think that's effectively regulatory malpractice. And so, as a quick reminder, these powers are number 1, regulatory foresight. So that's anticipating what's coming. Number 2, government engagement, building influence through relationships. 3, compliance leadership, going beyond minimum standards. Number 4, advocacy influence, shaping the regulatory narrative. Number 5, coalition building, finding strength in numbers. Number 6, regulatory adaptability, designing for agility. Number 7, public trust, which is all about earning a reputational capital. And number 8, societal alignment. And that's when you sync your goals with society's. As I continue to build out this framework, I'm digging into each one with more detail, exploring case studies that I've compiled in my research. And today, I look at how Ford, that's the motor company Ford, applied the powers of regulatory foresight and compliance leadership in voluntarily agreeing to California's stricter fuel efficiency framework ahead of federal requirements. The payoff for Ford, well, avoiding a patchwork of standards while securing regulatory certainty and goodwill with regulators. So let's dig into this case study. This is a doozy today. It's a long one, but I think there's a lot to learn here. So let's start with the snapshot. What happened? To me, this case study is fascinating because it involves big industrial players striking a deal with California to uphold stricter emission standards when the federal rules were poised to loosen. So it's a great example of proactive self-regulation to gain regulatory certainty in long-term product planning. All right, so let's start with the context. 2 roads that diverge. So if we rewind the tape to 2018, we find that the US auto industry was caught between dueling regulatory visions. On one side, we have the Trump 1.0 administration seeking to roll back Obama-era fuel and economy standards. The plan, well, freeze requirements at 2020 levels through 2026 instead of continuing to tighten them. The safer, affordable, fuel-efficient, safe vehicles plan represented a dramatic loosening of rules far beyond what the auto industry was actually expecting. On the other side, California, empowered by a special Clean Air Act waiver, insisted on maintaining stricter standards to fight smog and climate change as it had for decades. Under the Clean Air Act, California holds this unique authority to set its own auto emissions rules, and it does so with EPA approval. And a coalition of 13 other states plus DC can opt into these standards. These other states make up 1/3 of the US market, which means that California's regulations have a massive impact on the automakers' national strategies. This should come as no surprise, but the Trump administration was on a mission to revoke California's waiver outright, aiming to eliminate that state's power to go beyond federal requirements. And Trump took to Twitter to tell the automakers to come on side to make cars far less expensive for consumers. And so he was very much making this a play about consumer affordability, more so than anything related to climate change action. But here was the dilemma facing the automakers. The industry feared a regulatory schism, a scenario of split markets requiring 2 sets of vehicles. One to meet California-led states' rules, and another for federal rules. That was one option. Or it faced years of litigation, which would only create sustained uncertainty. And they said as much in a June 2019 letter to President Trump, with 17 major automakers warning that a prolonged fight and patchwork regulations would be untenable. Their ask, a compromise between the federal government and California. And what's interesting here is that most automakers were not asking for the Obama-era targets to be scrapped. In fact, all major automakers publicly opposed the Trump administration's preferred option of a freeze at 2020 levels. They were seeking certainty and moderate improvement rather than a whipsaw in either direction. Then what happens is a rogue four make their move. In July 2019, Ford, Honda, BMW, and Volkswagen struck a voluntary agreement with the California Air Resources Board to follow stricter emission standards through 2026, exceeding the lenient federal requirements. Trump, of course, responded in typical Trump fashion, stepping up a series of attacks on the automakers for not backing his administration's plans to roll back fuel efficiency rules, going really hard after Ford in particular as an American manufacturer. He said that the company founder, Henry Ford, would be, quote, very disappointed if he saw his modern day descendants wanting to build a much more expensive car that is far less safe and doesn't work as well because execs don't want to fight California regulators, unquote. Typical Trump stuff, right? Ford, though, held its ground. Under this deal, Ford and its co-signatories agreed to yearly fuel efficiency improvements that were more ambitious than the Trump rules, but slightly less stringent than the original Obama-era plan. And so, in other words, they chose to meet a higher bar than the law required, even as Washington at this time was headed in the opposite direction. Why this matters? Well, for a major U.S. automaker to voluntarily embrace tougher environmental rules was virtually unprecedented. Traditionally, the industry lobbies for the most flexible, low-cost regulatory option. Yet this time, the strategic assessment produced a different path. That taking the high road on emissions would be commercially advantageous, even if it caused significant political heartburn with the President of the United States. And while Ford used the moment to virtue signal, it publicly noted, we believe we mutually deliver on CO2 reductions consistent with the Paris Climate Accord. It pointed to a planned $11 billion investment to put 40 hybrid and electric models on the road by 2022. This was motivated by a more practical need, one set of standards nationwide to avoid chaos. Let's look at the strategy behind compliance leadership. And there's also some that you'll notice as we walk through this case study and the strategy, there's also regulatory foresight comes out play. So the decision by the Rogue Four came as a surprise at the time, but it was the obvious move for Ford to make because its top executive had already committed to aligning the company with global climate goals and cleaner vehicles, a commitment that made stricter emission standards a feature, not a bug, of their commercial strategy. So here what we're doing is you're taking the highest level of compliance, even if you're not required to, and you reduce longer-term regulatory risk. It's so obvious when we see it play out like this, but how many organizations actively seek to embrace the highest regulatory regime? In my experience, regulatory and public affairs teams are tasked with slowing down or reversing stricter regulatory regimes. And so this is very much swimming against the current. Several key factors drove Ford's compliance leadership strategy. First, reputation and brand trust. While it may not feel like it now in 2025, this case study takes place in an era of rising environmental awareness, which means Ford's alignment with strict emissions standards would help bolster its image as a responsible automaker. The move also differentiated Ford as a company willing to do the right thing, even when it wasn't forced to. Not a bad message to convey in an eco-conscious market like California and in global markets like Europe. And I bet many employees felt a sudden surge of pride in this moment as well. So that also helps with internal productivity. Next, authenticity. CEO Bill Ford had long championed sustainability within the company, contrasting with competitors lobbying for rollbacks. So compliance leadership positioned Ford, the brand, and Ford, the CEO, as an industry good guy. So in other words, the decision was a natural one, requiring a lot less explaining. And as we all know, when you're explaining, you're losing. Also, key to the strategy was foresight. Here, this is where we see a second regulatory power at play. Ford correctly anticipated the political winds would eventually shift. So by 2019, with 1 year left in the Trump 1.0 administration, the company would have a heightened level of confidence that states and perhaps a future federal administration would push back on Trump's rollback. So by exceeding the minimum, Ford gained a seat at the table in shaping future regulations. And in fact, after the 2020 election, Ford actively urged other automakers to embrace the California framework as the basis for nationwide standards. Always an easy ask when you're already compliant. Another core aspect of the strategy, influence. Ford's early compliance made it a natural partner for regulators drafting new rules. California's air regulator chair, Mary Nichols, even suggested the Ford California Agreement was a, quote, good template, unquote, for national policy. So in other words, compliance becomes leverage. Guide the rulemaking instead of resisting it. This is what holding regulatory power looks like. Ford's influence could ensure the future standards were not only stricter, but also practical and in line with Ford's technical readiness. Another aspect of the strategy, alignment and investment. Well before these events, Ford had committed billions of dollars to develop electric vehicles, hybrids, and other clean technologies. The company's product roadmap, including models like the Mustang Mach-E, electric crossover, and F-150 Lightning electric pickup, depended on a transition to lower emissions. So by 2019, Ford was already on track to invest $11 billion in electrification with plans for dozens of electrified models by early 2020. Ford executives viewed stronger standards as catalysts for innovation, clear targets that justified and accelerated the company's R&D in efficient engines, batteries, and lightweight materials. So rather than strand those investments, Ford's voluntary compliance synchronized policy with its engineering trajectory. There's also a competitive edge here. Competitors taking the opposite approach, those delaying innovation in hopes of laxer rules, risked being caught flat-footed when inevitably standards tightened or market demand shifted to greener vehicles. Another core aspect of the strategy here is avoiding market fragmentation. Different standards in different states can force automakers to either build two versions of each car, which is expensive and inefficient, or else limit certain models to certain regions. And that would mean conceding sales where they don't comply. So Ford's deal with California was a way to preempt this problem. By designing all its cars to meet the higher standard, Ford would effectively have one national fleet that could be sold in all 50 states without issue. This simplifies manufacturing and supply chains management. It also wins favor in states like California, in states following California's lead. So Ford would have plenty of compliant models available for sale, whereas a rival sticking to weaker federal rules might find itself unable to offer those models in a large chunk of the market. In short, Ford bet that the cost of extra compliance now was lower than the cost of regulatory whiplash and market fragmentation later. And finally, the other aspect of the strategy is global competitiveness. So outside the US, many countries were tightening emissions standards and promoting electric vehicles aggressively. Europe, for example, had stringent CO2 targets for automakers, and China was moving quickly on electric cars. If the US went lenient, but the rest of the world didn't, American automakers risked falling behind global competitors in clean tech. So by voluntarily staying on a stricter path, Ford ensured it remained competitive internationally and wasn't locked into outdated technology. Now, all of this came with some political blowback, right? It's one thing to develop the strategy and execute it. It's another to stick to it in the face of political attack. And the attack went well beyond Trump's public lambasting of Ford on Twitter. The Environmental Protection Agency rebuked the voluntary California framework, dismissing it as, quote, nothing more than a press release with no impact and a glorified PR stunt, unquote. Much more alarming, the U.S. Department of Justice opened an antitrust investigation into the 4 automakers involved in the deal. The implication here was a simple one, that by collaborating on the California emissions standard, Ford and its peers were conspiring to raise consumer prices or limit choice. California's governor blasted the DOJ's move as trumped-up charges, a blatant attempt by the Trump administration to prevent more automakers from joining California. And the case was eventually dropped, but it lingered long enough that one automaker that had contemplated joining the voluntary framework backed away. So how did Ford respond in all this? Well, it defended its choice on principle and data. It responded to the attack by stating that it, quote, focused on acting to protect the environment while also protecting the affordability of vehicles, unquote. And unlike some competitors, It did not seek to placate the administration with half measures. Now, it's important when we look at regulatory powers that certain brands have or wield or use, we have to look at what impact that has in a competitive landscape, right? So Ford was one of 4 automakers who signed the voluntary framework, but what about the others? Well, General Motors and Toyota, 2 of the world's largest automakers, chose to back the Trump administration's approach. GM criticized the California agreement on the grounds that it didn't give enough credit for GM's investments in electric vehicles. And these automakers made a short-term calculation that aligning with a friendly federal administration would be safer than aligning with California's environmental stance. This divergence would prove temporary. You know what happens next, right? The 2020 U.S. presidential election, a President-elect Joe Biden signaled a return, to aggressive climate action and support for electric vehicles. GM announced a remarkable about-face. CEO Mary Barra announced that GM was, quote, immediately withdrawing, unquote, from the Trump administration's lawsuit against California's authority. And she even invited other automakers to join GM in dropping opposition. This is where we see the power of regulatory foresight at play as well. GM had failed to see the potential change or fully consider how the Biden administration could reshape their regulatory environment. Better late than never, sure, but while GM was in reactionary mode, Ford was in the driver's seat, pardon the very bad pun. GM wasn't alone, though. In early 2021, Toyota, Fiat Chrysler, and a collection of automakers followed suit. In a joint statement, Toyota and others declared they were abandoning support for Trump's effort to block California, quote, in a gesture of good faith and to find a constructive path forward, unquote, with the Biden government. The group also voiced alignment with Biden's goals of continuous annual improvements in fuel economy. So it's quite the about face here. You compare this to Ford's role in this entire saga. It anticipated where the industry was headed and never had to flip-flop as a result. It was already positioned on the side of stronger standards and EV investment. So it was in an enviable position of welcoming the industry's and government's return to that trajectory. Its competitors, on the other hand, had to play catch-up in both policy stance and perhaps even technical or technological readiness. By 2021, every major automaker effectively joined Ford's position that a higher bar on emissions was the way forward. It turned what is often seen as a cost, regulation, into an opportunity to differentiate and lead. Let's take a breather and look at final takeaways. Number 1, Ford actively sought tougher rules, knowing it was positioned to meet them. In doing so, it gained moral authority and practical influence. So when a company demonstrates that stronger standards are achievable because it is already meeting them, it undercuts arguments that such regulations are impossible or economically ruinous. Number 2, this has a subtle but real effect on rulemaking. Regulators can point to that industry leader and say, if they can do it, the rest can too. So in Ford's case, the company's early adoption of higher emissions standards likely made it easier for the Biden administration to justify a more ambitious national policy because a chunk of the industry was already on board in practice. So Ford essentially modeled the future, and the future arrived faster as a result. And finally, number 3, by taking the first step, Ford set an industry benchmark. Even before any law compelled it, Ford's actions helped establish the California Agreement figures as the reference point for responsible industry behavior. Such leadership can snowball. Suppliers begin developing parts to the higher standard, trade associations start discussing how to implement it, and the whole ecosystem shifts as a result. The end result is a new baseline that the leader, Ford, was instrumental in creating and which it was already prepared to meet. So, by using the powers of foresight and compliance leadership, Ford was able to turn regulation into runway while competitors were still fighting the headwinds. And that's the kind of regulatory power that defines industry leaders in the age of politicized policy. And there we have it, a detailed case study. I hope you enjoyed it. Send me some comments, some questions, and some notes on this issue. I'd love to hear from you.